Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Democracy in Europe is facing its greatest challenge since the fall of the Berlin Wall. Romania, in this respect, should be regarded as a country of concern due to long-standing and unresolved problems with corruption and the rule of law. The mass protests that forced the Romanian government to abandon efforts to limit the scope of anti-corruption investigations in January show that there is overwhelming support for firm action in this area. Yet the strength of public feeling sometimes means that anti-corruption work is subject to inadequate scrutiny. In addition to dealing with many genuine acts of criminality, there are grounds for concluding that Romania's anti-corruption campaign has also provided convenient cover for acts of political score settling and serious human rights violations that show a troubling disregard for the rule of law. Indeed, the methods used often show a considerable degree of continuity with the practices and attitudes of the communist era. The conduct of Romania's anti-corruption campaign gives rise to 5 areas of specific concern. Number 1, the politicisation of justice. The claim that Romania's National Anti-Corruption Directorate, the DNA, and the Directorate of Investigation of Organised Crime and Terrorism, DICOT, act as impartial prosecutors is difficult to reconcile with the facts. There has often been a strong correlation between those targeted for prosecution and the interests of whoever happens to be in power at the time. Cases have sometimes been accompanied by campaigns of public vilification designed to maximise their political impact. 2, collusion between prosecutors and the executive. The rule of law requires a separation of powers in which prosecutors act independently of the executive. In Romania, it is apparent that politicians have at times exerted considerable operational influence over the DNA, using their control of key appointments. There is evidence in several cases to indicate improper contact between the DNA and the government and suggest that investigations have been politically directed. 3, the covert role of the intelligence services. The Romanian intelligence service, SRI, successor to the communist-era Securitate, plays a significant and largely undisclosed role in directing anti-corruption prosecutions. It carries out 20,000 telephone intercepts on behalf of the DNA every year, initiates DNA investigations, and in its own words, regards the judicial system as, quote, a tactical field of operations. These activities have not been adequately scrutinised, and the government has refused to respond to calls from organisations representing Romanian judges to investigate suspicions that the SRI has infiltrated the judiciary and the prosecution services. 4, lack of respect for judicial independence. Both the SRI and the DNA have been criticised for undermining judicial independence, another core principle of liberal justice. Judges who fail to do the DNA's bidding and rule in its favour have themselves become the target of investigation, while those deemed friendly to its interests have seen their loyalty repaid. A pliant judiciary willing to bend the rules helps the DNA to maintain extraordinary conviction rates of 92%. One senior judge on the Constitutional Court has also accused the SRI of unlawfully attempting to intimidate him and his colleagues. 5, abuses of process by anti-corruption prosecutors. Methods routinely employed by the DNA are incompatible with the standards that apply in most democratic countries. These include parading those arrested in handcuffs for the benefit of the media, threatening the relatives of suspects with indictment as a form of leverage, offering suspects immunity in exchange for implicating someone more senior and newsworthy, and systematically leaking evidence to the media to preclude a fair hearing in court. Important principles of justice, including the right to a fair trial and the presumption of innocence, are being routinely violated as part of Romania's anti-corruption campaign. When challenged on these points, the DNA is quick to resort to intimidatory tactics. I experienced this personally after a report I had written detailing many of these concerns was published in January of this year. I have provided a copy of the report to the Commission. Following widespread media coverage of the report, the DNA initiated an official inquiry by the Superior Council of Magistracy, which ruled against me on the 9th of May. In a bizarre example of Soviet-era doublethink, my work in exposing violations of judicial independence in Romania was itself deemed to be an assault on judicial independence. This process was intended to be intimidatory, revealing the DNA to be an organisation that operates without respect for democratic principles, including freedom of speech and the independence of civil society. The infringements of human rights taking place under the banner of anti-corruption ought to be a matter of serious concern to Romania's international partners. The rule of law is a vital pillar of democratic governance, and its weakness in Romania constitutes a major systemic risk in a strategically important region of Europe. The problem, as we saw with the protests earlier this year, is that Romanian politicians are not trusted to supervise the work of anti-corruption prosecutors. The DNA, DICOT and the SRI exploit that fact to operate beyond the boundaries of legitimate scrutiny, in effect operating as a state within a state. The US has an important role to play as a senior member of NATO and Romania's most important ally. The State Department human rights reporting should reflect increased concern about the consequences of Romania's approach to fighting corruption. Particular attention should be given to the question of whether Romania's domestic intelligence service operates under effective civilian control, as required under the terms of NATO membership. Additional tools should also be used to deal with the politicisation of justice. In at least one high-profile case, there are strong grounds for triggering the provisions of the Global Magnitsky Human Rights Accountability Act against individual human rights abusers in positions of authority. Thank you. On the question of the CVM reports, yes, the CVM mechanism is a necessary one. It was necessary at the time when Romania joined. It continues to be necessary, in my opinion. But you have to understand how the European Commission, who authored these reports, works. There is, I'm afraid, within the European Union, an enormous capacity for wishful thinking, not least with regard to the governance standards of its own members. Just look at how slow the EU has been to respond to the serious deterioration of democratic standards in Hungary, for example, and also more recently in Poland. It's been extremely slow to do so. Bear also in mind that the European Commission is the same organisation that verified Greece's national accounts more than a decade ago and allowed it to join the Eurozone when it was quite obvious that Greece's national accounts, and was said so at the time by many people, were not in any fit state to meet the convergence criteria for monetary union. Another example of epic wishful thinking by the European Union. I see the CVM reports that have been referred to in the same light, I'm afraid. I think they are an example of the EU turning its face away from a very difficult and growing problem right in front of its eyes because it's distracted with too many other things. It wants to believe that there is at least one part of this equation that is going right. I would ask you, by all means, consider the CVM reports, but also set them side by side with the testimony that's been given by the two associations of Romanian judges, who point to very, very serious concerns about standards of justice in Romania, about their own independence, how it is threatened by the Domestic Intelligence Agency, and ask yourselves who is more likely to have a better grasp of the health of justice in Romania, the judges who are administering it or some officials sitting in Brussels. I would say you should give more weight to the opinions of the judges. On very specific questions that Ambassador Gittenstein has raised, on the question of wiretaps, yes, the court struck down the wiretapping on anti-corruption cases. The government immediately, of course, re-legalised them through executive decree. So they're still going on. They haven't been stopped. The court decision counted for nothing, as it happens. On questions of political justice, I think my memorandum, I won't go into it in length now, but my memorandum establishes very clearly a strong pattern of politicised justice in Romania. And on the question of conviction rates, 92% conviction rate, yes, of course, that in itself isn't necessarily proof that the system is wrong. There are some systems which produce very high conviction rates for precisely the reason that Ambassador Gittenstein says. They filter out all cases that might be lost. Japan is another country that has very high conviction rates for that same reason. But the other sort of country, the other situation in which countries have managed to secure very high conviction rates are authoritarian countries or formerly authoritarian countries in which there is not a proper separation of powers, in which the court system operates as an arm of the state, not as a neutral arbiter between citizenry and state, and in which the judiciary is under pressure to do the bidding of powerful forces around it rather than come to independent judgments. I think everything that I know about Romania puts it in the second category of states that have deficient justice systems and not in the first category of justice systems that work to a high level of efficiency. In the world in which transparency and legality are functional, there is often too much of a willingness to accept capital flows and investment and the import of property from countries where there is widespread corruption, and there aren't sufficient checks often on the legality of those revenue flows. I think the UK is one country that is open to serious criticism actually on that front, particularly as it relates to property and money that's been transferred from the former Soviet countries. The second point I would make is that it's often very difficult, though, to distinguish between what is corrupt money and what isn't. Often very legitimate business people will try and transfer their capital out of these jurisdictions precisely because they fear becoming victims of corruption. You need to distinguish between the legitimate businesses that are trying to survive and protect their property and those that are trying to launder illegal property. The final thing I would say is be careful of this extradition issue. Quite often, corrupt authoritarian regimes will seek the extradition of political opponents on grounds of corruption, because they know that it's the easiest way to get Western governments to look the other way. It's the easiest way to put a stigma on the reputation of the person that they want to get back to their own country, not because they've done anything illegal, but because they're a political opponent and they want them to be shut up. So be very, very careful of the extradition process, because there is one case in the UK at the moment where the Romanian government is seeking the extradition of one German citizen on transparently political grounds. There's been an international arbitration tribunal ruling against the application for extradition under the European arrest warrant system. The Romanians have defied their legal obligations in refusing to withdraw that European arrest warrant application, and a British court is about to hear that case next month. I would urge this Commission to pay very close attention to that hearing and the evidence that will emerge in it, because it will substantiate very clearly the existence of politicised justice, of collusion between the executive and prosecutors, and the role of the SRI in driving a lot of that process. It's a very interesting case, and the documentation that emerges from that is something that the Commission should take into its own record, I feel. Thank you. I made some suggestions about what I thought Congress could do at the end of my my opening statement, and I expand on those a little bit in my memorandum. I think if I was to highlight one, I would say really ask some difficult questions of the State Department. Look at some of the things, look at some of the abuses that are detailed in my memo, and ask the State Department whether they are aware of these and why they're not reflected in their human rights reporting. For example, when you've got a situation where the Superior Council of Magistracy is taken over by a prosecutor, and some of the judges, some of the magistrates on that organisation object and try and organise against it, and the response of the DNA is to open investigations against two of the judges who are leading that campaign, that's a cause of serious concern. That's reflected in, I think it was either Freedom House or Human Rights Watch that drew attention to this. Their reporting reflects some of these concerns. Why is the State Department's reporting not reflecting some of these concerns? When you've got a situation where a sitting Prime Minister can call a newspaper owner who has been critical of him corrupt, and then say that shortly the prosecutors would be looking into this, and 2 weeks later that newspaper owner is arrested, you have to worry whether the politicians are pulling the strings of that prosecution. It seems pretty plain to me that it is. The same Prime Minister, Victor Ponta, did exactly the same thing against another newspaper owner. These are serious concerns, again, not reflected in State Department human rights reporting, not reflected either in the CVM reporting, which raises serious doubts about the integrity of that. When you've got a Constitutional Court judge who votes to strike down for the third time a surveillance bill that the SRI had campaigned for, and the very next day is arrested by the DNA for corruption, you have to wonder whether the timing is just a coincidence or whether that's actually something that really needs to be looked at properly. Not reflected in the CVM reporting, not reflected in State Department reporting. So ask some tough questions of your diplomats and ask whether they're not engaged in exactly the same kind of wishful thinking for other reasons that the EU is currently engaged in with respect to Romania. I will make one particular comment about the media environment, and that is one of the most pernicious examples of how the prosecutors try to skew the judicial system is the habitual practice of leaking information to the media pre-trial, particularly telephone transcripts that have been obtained by the SRI and that could only have got into the media via the SRI or the DNA. This is such a routine practice in Romania that it barely passes barely with comment most of the time. But if it was to happen in the UK or any other established judicial system, a judge would throw out the case because it would be impossible to have a fair trial in the context in which all the media had been selectively, all of the evidence had been selectively leaked to the national media. The second thing is I would draw your attention to the comments that were made in Romania a couple of days ago before a parliamentary inquiry by the Romanian ambassador here to Washington, who is also former head of the SRI, Ambassador Maior, in which he admitted that the SRI run penetration agents in the Romanian media. His excuse for this, quite without any sense of shame, was that this was necessary in a globalized era. Of course, we know that this has got nothing to do with globalization. This is a hangover from Soviet-era practice of the Securitate. the SRI run penetration agents in all levels of Romanian society, including the media, by the admission of a former head of the SRI and the ambassador to this country. Take a look at what he said. It's really quite extraordinary, I think, for any country, a member of the European Union, one that considers itself to be a fully developed democracy, for that kind of statement to be made. But it's on the record. I would just like to say, I agree with the other panelists that the fight against corruption is extremely important. It is a new front line in the fight for democratic values and democratic outcomes. But the anti-corruption fight cannot succeed unless it is also free of corruption. So there needs to be extra scrutiny of anti-corruption work to make sure that it's free of influences and considerations which are not based on the desire to stamp out corruption, but are based on other things. But thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to you today.